Welcome back. So, in the previous section, we talked about the design ingredients of typography, colors, images, icons, shadows, border radius, white space, and visual hierarchy. So, these are all very fundamental and crucial, but one really important ingredient of creating designs is still missing. And it is so crucial that it actually deserves its own section. And the missing ingredient that I'm talking about is actually designing components and layouts. So for this ingredient, we also need some general guidelines and, above all, a lot of inspiration. And so that's what this rule number 10 is all about. Now, it is split up in two parts actually, this lecture. So part 1 is right now, and the one about layout patterns is in the middle of the section. All right, but now let's start talking about how an actual web page is designed from scratch. So when you want to start a new website and start with an empty page and all you have is the content, you might feel very lost. But you don't have to feel lost. It doesn't have to be hard, because this is where well-established patterns come into play in order to help you. So basically, we build websites always in the same way. We start with some common small elements like paragraphs or images or buttons, which will contain our actual content. We then assemble these simple elements into common components, such as this feature row, or a feature card, or a pricing table, or a tabbed component. Then we take all the components that we designed and use them to build a layout using common layout patterns. Finally, we take all the smaller layouts like this one, or just one big layout, and assemble a final page from them. And so in the end, this is how we come up with a final design. So hopefully you see that there is in fact a system behind all this. So a web page is not just a bunch of random elements joined together, right? Instead, elements are organized into components, which are then organized into one or more layouts, which in the end make up a final web page. So whenever you need to start a new design from a blank page, this is how you proceed. You use common elements and components in order to present the information that you want on the website. And I will of course show you the most common elements and components in a minute, so to enable you to really create designs on your own in the future. But anyway, these components are then combined into layouts by using some common layout patterns, just as we saw in the previous slide, right? Now, some of these patterns are actually about repeating a certain component a couple of times, as you will see in the lecture about layout patterns. But anyway, finally, as I mentioned before, you take all your layouts and components and assemble them into the final page. So, as a summary, you do not need to get scared by a blank page and a brand new design. You just need to go step by step, follow common best practices that I will show you, and of course all the other design guidelines that you have been learning in the previous section. All right, and so now let me show you the most common elements, components, section components, and layout patterns that exist in web design and web development. So the most common elements, I would say, are text, buttons, images, input elements, and tags. And so it is these elements that we then combine into one of these components. Now, this list here is not exhaustive. There are a lot of other components that we can and that we do use, but I would say that these are the most common components that you will see in web designs. So in this lecture, I will show you some inspiration for elements and for these components. And actually not just some inspiration, but a lot of inspiration. So I'm sure you will love this lecture, because from the inspiration in this video, you will be able to take your design skills to the next level. I hope, at least. But anyway, in part 2 of this lecture, we will then talk about these, let's say, components that are actually a section. So I call them section components, and they are things like the navigation, the hero section, the footer, a call to action section, or a feature row. And finally, we will also talk about layout patterns in that part 2 of this lecture. So basically combining multiple components into a layout. All right, but let's get started with some inspiration about text. Now, text, of course, is very simple, and so the inspiration that I have here is basically for ways to start different website sections. So nothing all too exciting yet at this point, but still, it's good to start at the basics. And here is some more inspiration of how to start a section with text, because now there is this very popular way of adding a small and short and super descriptive title before the actual main heading. So just like we see in all of these examples here. Next up, we have some buttons, and we talked a lot about buttons before, but here you have one slide where you have basically all the different ways in which you can design buttons all in one place. So on the very left, you have a lot of different single buttons. And then here in the middle, we have basically a combination of two buttons, where one is the primary button for the primary action. And then at the side, there is another button with a lot less emphasis on it. So usually that one doesn't have any background color. And so this is a very common pattern that is used all the time. Next up, there is images, and we already talked a lot about images, so here are just some more ways of using them. Then here are input elements, and many of them are actually used to create big forms, but here we are just basically talking about these single input elements like we have here. For example, using just one field to input an email address with a small button besides it. Or here in the bottom, just a simple drop-down menu and some simple value pickers, basically. Now, just like in the previous section, I will of course not go into every single example here, because once again, and I promise this is the last time I'm saying this, so again, I want you to actually download these slides and study all these examples one by one on your own. So that's actually especially important in this lecture and part 2 of this lecture, because there is so much inspiration for so much different components. And so it's really important that you actually take a close look at all of these examples. And especially if you're actually right now with a task of designing some page. And probably I took something like 100 hours to compile all of these different examples for all the components and layouts. And therefore, I think there is a lot of value here that you can extract from these videos. And so, again, I think you can only get that value if you actually analyze each of the slides on your own with some time. But anyway, next up, there is tags, which are just a very, very simple element that we can use to create a visual representation of categories. So that's exactly what's happening here in each of these examples. And I'm pretty sure you have already seen tags used all the time as you browse the internet. All right, and now we actually move into the section of components. So for each of these types of components, I'm going to present you with a couple of examples, and I'm going to start with breadcrumbs. So these are usually used to help the user navigate a pretty complex site. So usually we only use and we only see breadcrumbs on websites that do actually have a deep level of page organization. So if you're just designing a simple landing page, then probably you're not going to need these. But actually there are many use cases in which they do make sense. And so this is how we usually design them. Next up, pagination, and I'm sure you have seen it many times. So when we have many results in some list, then we basically put them into many different pages. And then we need some buttons like these to navigate between these pages. And so here are 6 different ways in which they can be designed. Then we have alert and status bars. So these are small components that appear at the very top of the page with some kind of announcement usually. Or sometimes they're also like small alerts for web applications, like we see here on the right, where some item has been favorited, or the second one on the right, which says that the account has been connected. So again, alert and status bars are used to show the user that something new is happening, or, well, that just some action happened recently. Next up, we have statistics, which is basically some numbers that we want to show to the user about our product or our service, usually. And statistics can be pretty powerful in order to convince our users that our product is like really good for them. So here you have very different examples which does exactly that. And you see that there are also very creative ways in which these statistics can be displayed. So all of these that I have here are quite different. And yeah, I think this is a good source of inspiration if you want to do the same in your own designs. Next up, another powerful thing that you can use in your web design is galleries. So again, I'm sure you see galleries all the time, but there are actually many different ways in which we can do galleries. So there are more structured ways, like the 2 that you see in the bottom, and then there are also some more unstructured ways, which work very well in some situations as well. So this might depend a little bit on your website personality here, so you need to take that into account. Here is another bunch of examples, and again, these are a little bit more irregular, and sometimes we can even overlap images, which can also make for a nice effect. So if you need to design some kind of gallery, you can always come to one of these slides and get some inspiration. Now next up, we have the feature box, which is basically a box that groups together a bunch of information about something about a product. Now feature boxes come in all shapes and forms, but usually they all have a couple of things in common, which is that all of them uses some kind of icon or image. Then they use some bigger text, like some small headline, and then also some description. And of course, not all of the feature boxes follow this. So sometimes they might not have an image, but they have a link, like the one in the bottom corner. But in general, this is what a feature box look like. And later on in part 2 of this lecture, we will see that it's pretty common to actually combine these into rows or grids. So usually we don't have just one feature box, but we have multiple of them side by side. Now here are some more, and again we can see here that they do really come in all shapes and forms. What matters is that usually multiple of them will be combined in some form of layout. Then we have preview and profile cards, which are a little bit similar to feature boxes. But the difference is that these do actually contain some data points for something that they want to preview. So they might preview some kind of product or some kind of profile. And so they usually always have some data. So that's something that you see in all of these cards here. Also, we can usually click somewhere on the card and it will then lead us somewhere, so to some other page. And actually, I did mention this component of cards a couple of times already. For example, in the project of the last section, we did build some cards for each of the different chairs by the bottom of the page. Remember that? Then here, again, are some more, and all of them do have some kind of link somewhere, and also all of them have some kind of data points. But they are really all completely different. And that's why I have so many different here, because that way you can get more inspiration and more options to choose from when you build your own designs. And actually there's even more, and these are all profile cards. And I'm sure that you have seen most of them around in some kind of form on the web, but it's always nice to have multiple of them all in one place, so you can actually compare them, and in case you need to design one, you can then decide how exactly you want to do it. All right, next up we have the accordion, and accordion is basically a way of hiding information and only displaying it once the user clicks on one of the parts here. So this component is most commonly used in frequently asked questions, but it might also be used in some other part of the website where we do want to hide some content in the beginning in order not to clutter up the entire page. So basically, instead of showing all the information at once, we simply hide it in one container, and then only when we click the title, that content appears. And here is some more, of course, because there are many different ways of designing accordions. So once again, these are all pretty different, and that's why I wanted to show you multiple here. Next one is the tabbed component, or simply tabs. And once again, a very, very common one that we see all the time on pages. So this one too, just like the accordion, is to hide some information in the beginning and then show that information to the user once the right tab is clicked. Now the accordion, so the component that we saw before, is used mostly for frequently asked questions, as I mentioned. But the tabbed component, so this one here, is used many times for product features or also for bigger areas of content that we want to hide and to show selectively. And once again, there are actually many, many ways of designing these. So here are some more, and actually here 3 of them are vertical tabs. So the tabs are basically stacked vertically here, which is just another way of designing this if it fits your content best. Then we have another really popular component, which is the carousel, which is basically yet another way to have multiple pieces of content in the same place, so in the same area. And in this case, the user doesn't click on any tabs, but instead they can click on some button that will move them to the right or to the left of the carousel, and then the content will change. So here are 4 more, and these are all completely different once again. One thing that most of them have in common is that they have some dots in the bottom, which basically shows how many slides are in the carousel. I said slides, and that's because many times the carousel is also called a slider. So these are basically the same thing, I would say. And so, yeah, this is how you design them. Usually with some dots in the bottom and then some arrows at the left and the right side. Next up is customer testimonials. So this is where you ask your customers or the customers of the brand that you're building the website for their opinion on the product or the service. And this is actually one of the most important pieces on modern websites that you see these days. At least if it's some kind of website that tries to sell a product or a service. So you can really not leave out testimonials if you're building a site like that. And so that's why here I have a lot of different ways in which these can be displayed. And actually here are some more. And the first one there is actually just a wall of tweets. So that's what it's called when you just take a couple of tweets about a certain company or a certain brand and simply display those as testimonials. So that can be just another very powerful way of displaying testimonials, because that shows automatically that these are actually true. With all these other ones, the user cannot be 100% sure that you actually didn't fake them, which of course you should never ever do. Okay? So always use testimonials from real users and do not fake something. So that's a really, really bad practice. All right. And actually here I have some more because, well, again, this is really, really important stuff. And so you can choose the style that best fits the design that you already have in mind for your page. All right. And by the way, down here, we actually have 2 carousels that are being used for testimonials. So that's a pretty common trend that we see also, which again is to use carousels for testimonials. Next up, we have customer logos, which once again is really important stuff in case you are building some kind of marketing website. So basically what you do here is to take the logos of your biggest and most important and most well-known customers and display them all in one section like this. And so together with customer testimonials, this really helps to build trust in the brand or in the company that the website belongs to. So this is really important. And here are some more ways in which that can be done, because once again, this really should not be missed. At least, of course, if you have some customers in the first place. Of course, if you don't have any customers, or the company you're building this for doesn't have any customers, then you can't do this. But as soon as there are 2 or 3 customers, you should start displaying them like this. Then, very related are the featured in logos, which are once again to build trust with the user. So all of these are also called social proof. Now the difference between these logos and the customer logos is that these are basically from places where your website or the product has been featured in. So you see that all these logos here are basically some kind of newspaper or some kind of blog, right? So once again, these build trust with the customers. So if you can add a section like this, then really go for it. All right, another one is the steps component. And these do once again come in many different forms and shapes, but they can be very effective to actually show a customer how your product or how your service actually works. So you see that here in all of those where you have some numbers like 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4, and it takes the customer through the journey of actually getting started with the product or to actually use that product. And in my opinion, this is actually one of the very best ways that you can use to show how your website or how your product works. So if you need to do that, always go for some steps, because that really makes it very simple for the user to digest. Here are some more, and these are all vertical, which I also like a lot. And once again, a lot of diversity is to be found here. And so go for the one that you like the most and that also best fits the style that you already have for your page, right? Then, of course, we have forms, which are a crucial component in many websites. And most of these actually do what I showed you in the UX lecture, which is to align everything, so the label and the input field. But sometimes there is just not enough space, and then you can also do what they did here in the second form and the last one, which is to basically put the label right inside of the input field. Then here are some more forms, but these are quite different. So these are basically login or sign up forms. So again, something that is very common and which can be designed in a couple of different ways. And so here I wanted to show you some of them. Then here I have even more, and the first two are some forms that are bigger. So I wanted to show you that as well. And then the two in the bottom are some one-line forms. So basically just 2 or 3 inputs and then with a button on the side. All right, now tables, and I promise we're getting closer to the end. So it's 18 and we are at number 16. But tables are sometimes pretty important to simply display some kind of tabular data, right? So that's what a table is all about. And they can be designed in some very different ways. So please take some inspiration from this slide and also from this one. Now, the example in the top right corner might not be classified as a traditional table, but instead as a couple of cards, since it contains some data in each of those cards or in each of those elements. But we can also think about this simply being a different way of representing data. So basically a different way of creating a table. And so I decided to include it in this group along with these other more regular looking tables. Then we also have pricing tables, and these are very important and also very, very common on all marketing pages. So on pages for products or services that need to charge some money, basically. So a pricing table usually has a couple of different columns, each column for one different pricing plan. And then each of the columns has a title for the pricing plan, then some description, a price, all the features that are included, and usually also some kind of button to sign up for each of the pricing plans. Now, many times also the most popular one is highlighted, just as I had mentioned in some other lecture, I think. So that's the one that they want the user to choose, basically. So here are some more examples, and 3 of them are a little bit different, actually. So we can say they are a bit more creative and also a bit more simple. And finally, component number 18 are modal windows. Now, the ones that we see here on this page is what I actually call functional modal windows, because they are actually important for the application or the site itself. So for displaying the data of the site, or for example, to allow a user to actually sign in or sign up for the service. Then, on the other hand, we also have these more annoying marketing modal windows. So these are usually the ones that want to have your email address and want to basically give you something in return. Well, actually, one of them here is not like that, but at least the 2 ones on the left, they are clearly the marketing pop-up windows that I'm sure you have encountered all the time and which are really annoying. But still, they are a valid component that we can use. And so here, once again, I wanted you to get some inspiration. And with this, we finished this lecture, which is really mostly a gallery of all these different components. So that was the most important thing for this lecture, and also, of course, the whole process of how actually a page is designed from element all the way to a final layout. Now, in the next lecture, we will actually take one of these components, which is the accordion component, and build one using HTML and CSS. So we're finally going to be back to code, and so I can't wait to do that and to see you there.